They left Sverdlovsk in the brittle light of a Soviet January, 10 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute with rucksacks like small houses and a plan that fit neatly onto paper maps. They were young in the way that never stops being young, faces open to weather, laughter tucked into scarves, competence worn lightly as if it were a sweater instead of a hard-won habit. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, calm, meticulous, the kind of organizer who could coax a broken stove back to life and a disgruntled teammate back into the group's rhythm. He had logged miles in the taiga and the Urals, earned trust with spreadsheets and campfires, and he carried a notebook that would outlive all but the mountains. The goal was a winter ascent to Gora Otorten. I don't go there, in the Mansi tongue, a name hikers interpret with a shrug because mountains are always saying something like that. The route would qualify them for the coveted Grade 3 certificate, the top badge of Soviet tourism: long distances, harsh weather, heavy loads, clean logistics. They planned the way you plan a proof: lay out lemmas, settle the transitions, reserve a neat square for the quête at the land. Their kit was standard yet solid: canvas tent reinforced with an extra panel, a wood-burning stove that collapsed into itself like a puzzle box, axes with edges warmed by oil, skis that could sing across crusted snow, cameras parceled among them like a promise to remember. They were 10 at the start. One would turn back. His name was Yuri Yudin, and the ache that bit his joints felt like a trifling thing compared to friendship and pride. But it worsened with every kilometer. On January 28th, he looked Dyatlov in the eye and admitted what the code already knew. He would slow them. He would suffer. He should return. The group crowded him at the trailhead for photographs: fur hats, red cheeks, the ordinary intimacy of people who have shared cots and bread, teasing him for cowardice they didn't believe. He carried their jokes like talismans. He walked away into survival. He would spend the rest of his life, decades, wondering whether fate had spared him or simply sentenced him to a longer form of the same mystery. The remaining 9 moved north under skies whose colors were sentences without verbs. Daylight was a thin coin. Twilight was a belt drawn quick. In their diaries, which read now like messages washed ashore, they wrote of weather, clumsy pranks, small victories, the arithmetic of kilometers and calories. They teased each other, staged a mock Evening Otorten newspaper in pencil, and complained about the stove's caprices. They called Zina Kolmogorova Zinokshka in one breath and comrade in another, a Stalinist formality already loose in late Khrushchev days. They admired Dyatlov's competence. They relied on Zolotaryov's experience, the odd man out, older, tattooed, a wartime veteran whose presence remains the rumor engine's favorite spark. The land rose steadily, folding into itself, a white origami of ridges and saddles. On February 1st, they reached the shoulder of Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain, in the Mansi language. The name is misleading. Reindeer die there of thin grazing, not malice of the earth. Still, the wind comes with teeth. Snow slabs lie like sleeping plates. Dyatlov made a decision that hikers debate to this day. Rather than drop into the tree line for shelter, he led them to camp on the open slope. Perhaps it was to practice exposed camping, to stay en route, to avoid losing altitude they would only need to regain. Perhaps they misjudged the time. In the last known photographs, they are cutting blocks of snow, grinning at the effort, the tent rising like a pragmatic miracle against the pale world. Night took the mountain with the brevity of a blown-out match. They ate, logged notes, arranged boots and felted liners to dry near the stove. It was the night of February 1st into February 2nd. What woke them first? A sound, a pressure, a tremble. In the autopsy of speculation that would follow, the cause would alternate like a bad radio signal between avalanche, slab release, katabatic wind, missile test, intruder, panic, something unsayable. The hikers knew nothing of such arguments. They knew only the immediacy of survival. What is certain is this: at some point, something forced them out of the tent so irrevocably that they cut their way out from the inside and fled into temperatures that turned breath into needles within minutes. The search began when it always begins, when calm turned to silence, and silence to a shape no one could ignore. Back in Sverdlovsk, friends and families pressed administrators, and administrators, not eager to make a commotion over a youth hiking group in a country allergic to open embarrassment, nonetheless approved a rescue. It started with student teams, then expanded into Mansi hunters, local police, and military assets. Skiers combed the route like fingers through coarse hair. On February 26, the searchers found the tent standing where the wind had made it difficult to stand at all, collapsing inward, half buried, its entrance facing downhill, and its canvas cut open from the inside. The inside told a story more precise than the mind was ready to hear. Boots and warm clothes were left behind, not scattered, but ordered. Boots near packs, felt liners drying, bread slices laid out as if someone expected to return in a few minutes. A line of footprints, preserved by a quirk of wind and snow, led downslope toward the sparse shelter of the tree line, a half-dozen prints in stocking feet, some in felted socks, one in a single boot. No bounding panic. A measured walk. As if a unit following a plan, or as if the code itself had become a commander. Near the tree line they found the remnants of a cedar fire, branches clawed bare 5 meters up, bark scuffed by desperate feet. Beneath the cedar lay the first two bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonichenko, the two Yuris, often the heart of jokes in the diaries, lying in their underwear, barefoot, the skin of their legs marbled with the last work of blood when the furnace had nearly run out. Their hands were battered with small wounds, the kind you receive when you climb a tree with more urgency than grace. It looked like they had fought the cold the way one fights water, reflex against an element that refuses compromise. A few hundred meters back toward the tent lay Dyatlov himself, face toward camp as if crawling home by sheer grammar of leadership, and a little farther, Zina, stubborn, angled into the slope, the human equivalent of an unfinished sentence. Between them, searchers later found Rustem Slobodin, a strong athlete with a fractured skull, not crushed, but cracked in a way doctors called consistent with a fall. All three were dressed more warmly than the Yuris, in layers grabbed from friends, as if a triage of clothing had begun at the cedar fire, and then the group tried to ascend, perhaps to reclaim gear from the tent, perhaps to bring embers uphill, perhaps only because uphill felt like direction. For weeks more the mountain guarded its dead. Spring loosened the snowpack. In a ravine, beneath 4 meters of compacted white, searchers discovered the remaining 4, Ludmila Dubanina, Alexander Kolovatov, Nikolai Thibault Brignol, and Semyon Alexander Zolotaryov. Their injuries were not the injuries of frost alone. Dubanina's ribs were broken like the bars of a cage, her tongue and part of her lips were missing, damage the autopsies attributed to post-mortem processes in water and scavenging, though the phrase would fuel imaginations like dry kindling. Zolotaryov's chest was stove in as if compressed by a gentle but massive hand. Thibault Brignol's skull was similarly damaged without the external trauma that would accompany a club or a fall from a height. The doctor, tempted to precision by the Soviet habit of care with language, wrote that the force resembled a car crash. There were no defensive wounds, no bomber shrapnel. The bodies had lain in a little stream, under snow like glass. Some wore clothing cut from their dead friends at the cedar, sleeves torn off, belts repurposed. In the ravine, the hikers had built a snow den, a primitive shelter that testified to continued method amid catastrophe. Other details, minor at the time, metastasized into folklore. A Geiger counter, waved over some of the clothing by investigators trained to worry about the wrong sort of secrecy, ticked high enough to be notable but not catastrophic. Later we would learn that 2 of the students worked at a facility where radiation exposure was plausible. Clothing picks up worlds the way a dog picks up burrs. Some faces, in the morgue's harsh light, appeared tanned or orange, which winter plus wind plus morgue bulbs can accomplish well enough, but the adjective migrated to headlines where it grew more ominous. People spoke of paradoxical undressing and end-stage hypothermia behavior, yet the group's layering looks to the careful eye like improvisation, not confusion. Their camera negatives, a treasure trove in black and white, captured laughter, exertion, light snow crystals like halation in the air, and on the last frame of one, roll a blurred flare scholars still argue over. The official investigation closed with a sentence that explains nothing and everything. The hikers died due to a compelling natural force. In the Soviet Union of 1959, this was almost tender. It was an admission of ignorance shaped into a bureaucratic lullaby. The case files were boxed. The parents buried their children with less ceremony than they deserved. The mountains kept their own counsel. And yet, like all good mysteries, the Dyatlov Pass incident refused to become only grief. It turned into a machine that converts evidence into story. Over the decades, explanations multiplied like frost flowers. Avalanche, simple, powerful, indifferent. The tent was on a 28 to 30-degree slope, right at the dangerous angle, and drifting snow can stack like debt. But the tent had stood for weeks. The slope looked modest in photographs taken later. Trees near the campsite bore no fresh avalanche scars. Slab release refined the avalanche, not a roaring white wave, but a block of wind-loaded snow breaking loose silently, settling like a shifting roof straight onto the tent. This could crush ribs, drive panic, and leave a slope that looks undisturbed after the block had traveled only a few meters. The hikers cutting a snow pit to level the tent could have undercut the slab's anchor. The physics fit the autopsies better than high drama. Other theories burned hotter. Infrasound, generated by katabatic winds around the mountain's blunt geometry, could have induced panic through a physiological mechanism, an unseen pressure whispering danger into the midbrain. Yet the footprint showed order, not chaos, and the group's competence ran counter to mindless flight. Military tests. The Ural sky, after all, hosted experiments whose paperwork was friendlier to stamps than to signatures. Parachute mines exploding above the snow could produce blunt internal trauma without external lacerations. They could paint the night with light and shock. But the timing, the fallout, or lack of it, the absence of blast marks near the tent, and the reluctance of witnesses to whisper even in late decades, leaves the scenario hungry for evidence. Then there is the human specter, the Mansi hunters, imagined by outsiders as jealous of their land. The case file treats this with the politeness of a patient doctor. The Mansi helped with the search. Their tracks were not found near the tent. The injuries do not fit club and knife. The rumor survives mostly because prejudice survives, or foul play among the group, a fight. Yet the autopsies show no pattern of interpersonal violence, and the diaries read like the map of a team that argued gently about stoves and laughed more often than sulked. In the 2010s, a new seriousness returned. Russian prosecutors reopened an inquiry to settle the documents with a stamp that said avalanche, not as a flourish of novel insight, but as the adoption of the most parsimonious answer. Independent researchers borrowed tools from computer graphics and snow mechanics. A Swiss team, inspired in part by the film Frozen and the Disney animation models it had popularized, adapted equations of snow slab dynamics to the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. Their work, combined with wind records and the tent's placement measured from the old photos, showed that a small, dense slab could indeed break loose in the night. Delayed by hours after cutting the slope to level it, and compressed the tent with thorax-breaking force, as if a sheet of stone had settled 50 centimeters and the world had narrowed to that half meter. Panic would be rational. The knife would come out to slice the canvas. A retreat to the tree line would be procedure, not madness. A return uphill would be planned and then aborted by cold's tyranny. The ravine's injuries would be the work of a fall into a snow-covered gully. The model does not satisfy every taste, but it rescues Dyatlov's group from the insult of irrationality. They did not flee nonsense. They executed a survival plan under grotesque constraints and lost a fair fight to physics. Yet the human mind is not content with a clean equation when the setting is so operatic. The artifacts insist on detail. Zolotaryov died with a camera around his neck under layers, as if documentation itself were a reflex impossible to extinguish. Dubinina's tongue, scavenged by water and bacteria, morphed in retellings into a sign of ritual or cruelty. People do not love rivers as explanations when the river runs through their imaginations. Radiation became a motif even though levels were compatible with workplace carryover. A photograph of dim lights in the sky, captured by campers in the region that winter, pushed the narrative toward military tests. But lights in winter skies are as diverse as stars. Rockets, aurora, illusions at the edge of vision. Read the diaries and you find not fear but the texture of a road trip. "We can do everything," one entry says with the bravado of youth and the discipline of a checklist. Dyatlov writes like a quartermaster, Zina writes like a friend who knows how to set a table out of whatever the world has on hand. Kholat Syakhl is a good pair of hands and a steady grin. Dyatlov is quiet, a material scientist with a thoughtful gaze. Krivanechenko sings. Doroshenko burns bright and hot. They are ordinary in the way that becomes wholly opposed to what followed. The last page of their handmade newspaper jokes about Yeti sightings, about the clumsy party secretary at the institute, laughter as a scarf wrapped around the throat of winter. When you remember them, remember also the sort of people they were, competent, generous, unscared of effort. That is the only refutation a mountain ever deserves. There is a superstition that names cause outcomes. Kholat Syakhl, the mountain of the dead, was always going to be a character in any story that ended poorly there. But the Mansi name is neither curse nor taunt. It is ecology. Reindeer avoid the slope because the wind strips it, the snow turns to iron, and lichen has trouble persuading stone to host its feast. The hikers did not trespass on sacred ground. They camped on bad ground. The difference is not mystical, it is practical. And yet practical differences kill as reliably as mythical ones. When the bodies returned to Sverdlovsk, the city clock continued to mark factory shifts and party meetings. Parents were asked to mourn privately, teachers to speak briefly, the institute to continue its business of manufacturing engineers for a nation that building demanded. Yuri Yudin stood graveside as if he had been placed on the wrong side of a page, the living co-author of a book whose conclusion refused to include him. He would dedicate his years to walking the documents, talking to investigators, answering journalists, and visiting the families who needed someone who had held the lost one's mittens and laughed at their jokes. He was their ambassador from an evening before the storm. The Dyatlov Pass incident is shaped like a lens. What you bring to it will be enlarged. If you bring suspicion of states, it will reward you. Soviet opacity left spaces where conjecture grows tall as pine. If you bring curiosity about mountains, it will teach you. Snow's mechanical behavior is a literature of its own, and the Urals write in gusts and slabs. If you bring grief, the case is a school where the lessons are honest. Competence is not immunity. Careful plans fail under loads no one predicts. Leadership is sometimes doing the rational thing and dying anyway. What does the story owe the dead? It owes them accuracy where accuracy is possible, humility where it is not, and a refusal to make them props in dramas chosen for fun. It owes them the charity of presuming they tried everything that made sense, that they kept their heads, that they loved one another in the unshowy way of passing socks and cutting sleeves from your own shirt for a friend who needs it more. It owes them the acknowledgement that heroism can look like a line of footprints in measured intervals, not a cinematic charge. It owes them the truth that the wilderness does not hate us. It simply fails to notice. In the tree-lined clearing where the cedar once bore witness, the snow grows soft in spring, and the stream speaks the kind of language water is fluent in. Repetition, patient grammar, the moral of gravity. Hikers still visit, some to pay respects, some to measure slopes with smartphones, some to photograph their boots near a plaque and hashtag a mystery. The wind rehearses its only song. On certain days it feels as if the air itself remembers the shape of 9 bodies moving through it. You can end the story cleanly, with a snow slab motto and a respectful silence. Or you can leave one corner unstitched, as evidence often demands. Maybe the slab did not fall until late. Maybe it did not fall at all, and instead the wind built a cornice that collapsed under its own spite, or a noise in the night resembled thunder from within the earth so closely that running in socks felt like sanity. Maybe missile tests painted a brief false dawn above the ridge, and trained minds made a trained mistake. To think a temporary exit was temporary. The tent, once cut, becomes a truth. No going back without repair, and repair demanded light that the sky would not provide. They left because leaving was right. They died because the code has no mercy clause. If you need an image to carry with you when the credits roll, imagine Dyatlov last seen by the living as he turned uphill with hands already numb. The leadership that had always been quiet, becoming quieter still, a kind of geometry. Tent equals warmth, warmth equals life, life equals step after step into a wind that will negotiate with no one. Imagine Zina kneeling beside a friend to tuck a scarf before she herself climbed. Imagine the 2 Yuris at the cedar, hammering at branches, planting a small defiant fire in a world made of things that did not want to burn. Imagine the snow den in the ravine, a fragile architecture made by hands that still believed dawn would come in time.